Nutrimedical Report, and of course it's Wednesday, first hour. We have Harley Schlanger here from the LaRouche Foundation. The website is LaRouche, LaRouchePAC.com, and of course the Executive Intelligence Review is LaRouchePUB.com. Harley, there's lots of amazing stories to talk about today. I'm going to do some of the headlines, and you'll fill all of it in, of course. To stop World War III, Hillary must expose Obama's Benghazi lies. If you are serious about stopping a thermonuclear war, there is a high premium on thinking. Like your headlines. The human race is in danger of extinction. Semicolon, are you human? Question mark. Yeah, right, good one. Obama escalates in Syria. Stars and Stripes runs accurate warning. We talked about this the other day with Tim Alexander about Mr. Putin's response to Erdogan, who's built a palace that is ridiculous and who wants to be the next caliphate of the Islamic republics across the Middle East and Asia. This is really going to get intense. Putin's response, and he doesn't drink vodka, so he's thinking straight, is very serious of turning the city of Damascus into Stalingrad for, quote, Erdogan and his little Hitlers, including Obama.
Well, and the Stars and Stripes, which is a U.S. Army newspaper, has an op-ed by a historian named Stephen Weissman, in which he said that what the administration is doing in Syria, with the idea that we will respond to any attack on U.S.-trained rebels of this Division 30, that this is an undeclared war against the Assad government. You put that together with the go-ahead being given to Turkey, and what are the Turks doing? They're not attacking ISIS, they're attacking the Kurds in Turkey. And so you now have the U.S. government collaborating with the Turkish regime to attack the Kurds who are fighting ISIS. The Obama administration is now saying they have the right to bomb anyone in Syria that attacks the U.S.-trained rebels. And this is where you see the total fraud of this thing. There's less than 60 people in this Division 30 who are now being put in the middle of an intense civil war. And within 2 days after they were unleashed, their two leaders were kidnapped by al-Nusra, which is the al-Qaeda front in Syria. And so Obama said, well, any attack on them will be followed up by U.S. bombing. Well, what if it's the Syrian government that attacks them? Because they're, after all, in a civil war against the Syrian government. If we attack Syrian government forces, that is an undeclared war, a violation of the Constitution, and Democratic Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia came out yesterday saying that Obama must come to the Congress before he does something like this.
Well, why don't they just
impeach him? Bill, in the summer of 2013, when Obama was going to bomb Syria over the so-called sarin gas episode, which he said had ironclad proof that it was the Syrian government that used it,
right,
when in fact now everyone knows it was the Syrian rebels. There were 200 congressmen who signed a letter to Obama saying that you cannot attack Syria without going to get an authorization to use military force from the Congress. Now, where are those 200 congressmen today? They're silent. They're saying nothing. They're giving the president the option of declaring war without the constitutional responsibility of getting the Congress, as the representatives of the American people, to approve it. This is an impeachable offense, just as it was in Libya.
Right.
And so what we're saying is you can use the continuity of policy of regime change in Libya and regime change in Syria, which puts us on the side of al-Qaeda and ISIS, to show that the president is not only acting against the interests of the United States, but against the Constitution, which he's sworn to uphold.
Well, I think that we have to understand that he is the great destroyer. Obama has been the most destructive president of the United States in our reputation and our economy in history. And he is a blight on the office of the presidency. And what we need to do is we need to impeach him immediately, because one or another of his actions is going to result. And I'll give you an example. The response to the words of Mr. Putin this week against Erdogan, and it goes to the little Hitlers, including Obama, that want to do these actions against Syria. And he says, and he quotes, Russia, Iran, and China are now in alliance against America and this action. That means that Russia, by the way, has a policy what's called preemption, which means if they think war is imminent with America, they may just nuke our cities. They may not wait for a troop placement or a front to develop. They may just decide, let's just nuke them. And
well, there's an article today in the New York Observer under the headline, "Can the U.S. Stop a War with Russia?" And it's written by a former TV reporter named Jack Hannock, who used to live in Moscow. Now he's back in the United States. But he said the Russians have drawn a red line. Ukraine cannot be part of NATO. If new hostilities start, Russia will not let the war be a proxy war where the U.S. supplies weapons and advisors and lets others do the boots-on-the-ground combat. Russia will take the war to the United States.
Right, to our shores immediately. And people don't understand that Russian naval ships have been off our coast for the last few years. Putin has had them off our coast. They have bear bomber runs every week running off the coast of the east and west coast. They come within 90 miles of the coast and could easily shove off hundreds of hypersonic cruise missiles that could destroy all our cities. And these idiots in Washington, and Obama, the chief idiot and puppet and prostitute of the political system by George Soros and the maniacs, are pushing the button to the point now where we could literally have a thermonuclear war without any preemption, without any advance warning. The Russians could just say, let's just nuke their military bases right off the bat. And if that's not enough, we'll start nuking their cities.
Well, now here's the other thing that's interesting about this guy Hannock's report. He said that Americans are told that the Russian people support Putin because they're fed propaganda by the state-controlled media. He said there are 300 television stations in Moscow. Only 6 are state-controlled. They have access to BBC, CNN, all the Western stations. But the Russian people don't believe the Western stations. Now, this is interesting because we're basically told that the Russians are like the North Koreans. They're censored. They don't get news. But this week, the Russians kicked out the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the group that Soros funded and funded by the U.S. government. Soros' organization was also kicked out of Russia because the Russians are saying they're involved in coup operations and regime change against the Russian government. And the human rights people, instead of being upset that there's a plan to provoke a regime change in Russia, are saying that the Russians have no right to remove these so-called human rights groups. What is there in human rights about installing pro-Nazis in Ukraine?
Right.
So, I think a lot of the issues that we've been discussing over the last months are coming into clear focus now. And it's obvious that there's an effort to provoke either a Russian backdown or a U.S. preemptive strike combined with cyber attack on Russian retaliation with the idea that we could win a nuclear war. And that, my friends, is insane.
Right. There's no winning a war. By the way, the Russians can evade all of our so-called anti-missile systems. I know technically and can give specifics as to how useless our system is. And even our F-35 fighters can't come up against even fighters that the Russians made 30 years ago. The fact is, we're toast. Our Navy and our carrier groups, even naval experts here in San Diego, have stated that our naval group cannot withstand the hypersonic cruise missiles that the Russians have, the Hoot supercavitation torpedoes. We are finished. And the idea of engagement with Russia on a military basis is insane. So if you're listening out there, government, military officers, get a life. Realize we don't impeach Obama and, if necessary, a military coup. If we don't do something to decapitate this insane government, we're going to be at war. Wow, Harley, these are pretty shocking revelations. And, of course, the statements by Putin, which we read, Tim read yesterday on air, means basically we're up against it. Obama basically is declaring war in Syria, and if this devolves, it could devolve literally in days or weeks, not months or years, into a full-fledged conflict. And, of course, Erdogan has got narcissistic attitudes toward the whole idea of becoming the lead nation among all the Muslim nations and becoming a full member of the European Union as well. This is a very dangerous situation. Of course, it's forcing Russia to make steps and plans that he really doesn't want to do. I mean, you can tell the Russians are protesting
Bill,
all the way toward war.
You and I talked about this going back to the summer of 2013 when the American people, the Congress, and the military all moved against Obama's plan to launch strikes on Syria, allegedly in retaliation for use of chemical weapons. Now, at that time, people knew that and you and I discussed this would be seen by Russia as an attack on Russia because it would be an attempt to ground the Syrian Air Force. And the Syrian Air Force not only has many MiG fighters, but it has Russian pilots who are minimally training the Syrians, but also manage some of the ground operations, the repair, logistics, and so on. And there probably would be Russian casualties. Now, at that time, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, went to Obama very early the morning that the attacks were supposed to take place and said, Mr. President, if you want us to carry out a mission, we'll do it. But you need to go to the Congress because this is not just a simple case of bombing a few locations. We could have our planes shot down. We could be engaging Syrian fighters, and we could be engaging Russian fighters. So you'd better get your ducks in a row before you order this. Obama then went to the Congress, and the Congress rejected the proposal. Now, here we are 2 years later. General Dempsey is on his way out. The new crew coming in at the Joint Chiefs of Staff appear to be Obama-approved, which means brainwashed idiots willing to support the idea that Russia is an existential threat to the United States. Yesterday, John Kerry, the Secretary of State, met with Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, in Doha. And the first thing Lavrov brought up is, are you prepared to go to war in Syria? Do you realize that's what the president just said? And Kerry mumbled and gave what Lavrov said was a very unsatisfactory answer. Later that day, the State Department spokesman was asked by the press, what is the legal justification of the U.S. saying that we're going to launch military strikes in Syria against anyone who attacks these American-trained fighters? And as I said, you're putting 60 people in the middle of a civil war. They're not prepared to fight a war. They're going to end up defecting probably to the other side. And when the State Department spokesman was asked, what's the legal justification? He hemmed and hawed, and then he said, I'll have to get back to you on that. And today, when it was brought up again, he did the same thing, because there is no legal justification. Now, this writer in Stars and Stripes said this is very much like the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, which was a fabricated event that Lyndon Johnson used to get the United States into the war in Vietnam. Now, the fact that people know that and now can make the connection between Obama's support for ISIS in the Middle East to his overthrow of Gaddafi and the support of al-Qaeda in Libya, this is impeachable. He's twice now acted against the Constitution, against the War Powers Act, to order U.S. military attacks without the approval of Congress at a point at which there's no evidence that the so-called enemy has done anything against American interests or Americans.
Well, the thing is, he's also made the statements which has also said that he will take orders from the United Nations rather than from Congress. He's literally done, in a sense, a decapitation of Congress.
But even on this, he's not going to the UN because he knows that the UN would say this is a violation.
Right, even the UN won't approve of what he's doing, and yet he's rushing ahead. Now, what do you think the purpose is? Because it doesn't make sense, does it?
Well, the deeper purpose is that you have a usual situation which occurs in August, which is that most countries, the parliaments, the congresses are out of session. And that's why wars start so often in August. Because when you have a power-mad narcissist like Obama, who is finding that the world will not bend to his great charm, that he can't get the Russians to commit national suicide to bail out the banking system. The Chinese won't bend to him doing that. The Europeans are now resisting to some extent the continued sanctions and the war policy in Europe. In the Middle East, none of these governments are willing to accept Obama as their boss. And so at a point where things seem to be turning against him, what does he do? He does the same thing that any criminally insane president does, which is assert executive authority to do whatever he wants.
Yeah,
and that's why
the thing is
that's why the 25th Amendment and the Articles of Impeachment exist.
Well, the thing is, he demonstrates a kind of narcissistic mental illness that by itself should disempower him from the ability to operate in the office of a president.
And here's the thing that's tragic about it. There are many people, including large numbers of Democrats in the Congress, who know that. When he went and lectured them about why they have to support the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Democrats came out of that meeting saying, who the hell does he think he is? Obama called a meeting where he said he wanted to have a dialogue with them about the TPP. Then he lectured them about how they're giving into the racism that's been characteristic of the attitude against him since he first became president. Now, members of the Black Caucus were furious. The idea that their opposition to Obama's fraudulent trade agreement had to do with the fact that they were giving in to racism, and yet they opposed him.
He plays that card all the time, doesn't he? He plays that card all the time.
Yeah. And you'd think at a certain point, people, including the Black Caucus, would say, you're crying wolf too often for the sake of an agenda which goes against the interests of African Americans.
Yeah, amazing.
So we're in a situation. I told you in the break, I was on a conference call today with a whistleblower. We're talking to people in the military, the intelligence community, and we're saying to everybody, you have to come out right now and demand that the Benghazi investigation go full gear at this moment to take the power of war out of President Obama's hands.
Wow. It's a very dangerous time. It's a very dangerous time indeed that we're allowing this kind of maniac to be in a position like this. It's hard to understand, isn't it?
Well, it's submission.
Yeah, we can't do it. We can't do this. This is not reasonable. And welcome back. And Harley, let's continue through the analysis of this crazy news. I mean, this is the kind of news that's like I call deathbed for the planet news. Let's put it that way. If Obama's not neutralized, this particular declaration, if it gets its fulfillment along with his cohorts, as they say, as Putin claims it very clearly, little Hitlers, they'll turn Syria into their Stalingrad. I mean, do they understand what that means? Do they understand that America is on the precipice of an economic disaster and a geopolitical and a World War disaster? Do they understand that?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, look, very few people in the United States know anything about what happened in World War II and the fact that the Russians really were our allies in that war. And in fact, they took the brunt of the fighting from the Nazis. There were more divisions deployed by the Germans on the Russian front than on the whole of the Western front. And that the Russian sacrifices were enormous. And whether you can dismiss it by saying, well, they're communists and they weren't very good, but the fact is they were fighting for their nation. And the people who fought in the war didn't care whether it was Stalin or Tsar Peter the Great who was the commander. They responded to defend their nation. The Russian Orthodox Church, which had been suppressed for a period of time under Stalin and the communists, during the war, they came out and demanded that their people, as their religious duty, support the government. So you had the Russian people who mobilized to defeat the Nazis. Now you're seeing, at terrible cost, now what are you seeing? You're seeing Nazis on the border of Russia, in Ukraine, because the right sector, the people who are the major people in the military forces and the security forces of Ukraine, come from this neo-Nazi gang called the Banderistas. These were people who were condemned in 2011 by the European Union for racism, anti-Semitism, and fascist outlook. And yet today the European Union is supporting them. So what does that tell you? It tells you that we've lost the element of moral responsibility that used to be the hallmark of America, that we stood up for what was right. And so the fact that we're now overthrowing another regime, I mean, Assad won an election which various human rights agencies said was a fair election. He got 86% of the vote in the last election.
I don't think any politician in modern history has had more votes.
Well, and here you have Putin, who is at about 90% popularity in Russia. And if you actually investigate it, what you find, I think I read you this quote earlier, the Russian people have access to CNN and BBC. They can watch the United States denounce Russia on their networks, and they just don't believe it because they support Putin because he's appealing to them as Christians and nationalists to stand up against what's being conducted against them. And don't forget, whether you think he's a little authoritarian when it comes to suppressing this rock music gang, the so-called Pussy Riot, they went into a church and did songs that were defamatory in the Russian Orthodox Church in the Kremlin. That's what they were jailed for. They weren't jailed for their, if they would have done that on the street, they would have been allowed to do it. They did it in a church. What would happen if people went into a U.S. church and pulled off their clothes and put coverings over their head and called the president lots of names?
Right.
You'd probably have them thrown in prison here.
Right. I think what happened is we have an attitude of other countries cannot stop our orange revolutionaries coming in and kind of trying to overthrow, because you see a lot of these people, like the Pussy Riot and so on, are all funded by George Soros and these groups that want to literally change the internal politics of a country or rip it apart. And the Russians basically...
And the Russians know it. They just kicked out the National Endowment for Democracy and Soros' organization because of their constant policy of insulting the Russian people.
Right. They understand that this is a geocultural attack against the Russian people and their culture, and they're not interested in it. And that's why Mr. Putin made his statement about American attitude toward letting Muslims in their country. He says anybody who comes here to Russia must become Russian and act Russian. In other words, the exact opposite of what Obama's doing. He's flooding the country with illegals, which even Hispanic people are terrified of because they're taking their jobs. They're giving benefits. They have an open border. They don't want to deal with sanctuary cities with the illegal criminals that are coming in. They don't have what we call a guest worker program that works, which would be easy to fix in a matter of days, so that you'd bring people in buses with bottled water across to guest work and then get them back to Mexico. What we have is an out-of-control situation, and Obama likes it because this is what he's doing, deconstructing America.
Well, the important thing to understand about Obama is that he is working for people who don't care for the United States. They have no interest in the American government or the American people except to control it to defend their policies, their corrupt system. And this is a system which is collapsing. And yet we're on the inside here, and we're basically told this is our country, this is our system, we should be happy about it. We should see this as a great benefit. And there's no benefit to the American people from this.
Yeah, it really is crazy what's going on, isn't it?
Well, and did you hear, actually, very interesting, the Trans-Pacific Partnership has been pretty much blown up because Japan and Canada oppose the policies on grain and other things. Australia is opposed to the sugar, and about 8 countries are opposed to the United States' attempt to enforce patent laws that give the pharmaceutical corporations the right to overcharge for medication. And so instead of, after Obama rammed it through the Congress, our so-called trading partners won't support it. And so it was
not.
what you call the classic Pyrrhic victory.
What it is, basically, American-based transnational corporations using Congress as their prostitute, so that they can ram through a trade bill that'll crush other nations, force the drug costs, for example, for countries like Canada and Australia, right through the ceiling, and give drug companies even more power to crush natural, nutraceutical, or other medical advances because they fund the medical schools and the state licensing authorities, etc. And they want to invade other countries and make sure they do the same thing they've done to this country, which is why medical advances don't happen in America anymore. They're very rare. When we have them, and they do happen, like GCMAF, they kill people like Dr. Bartlett with a bullet in the chest floating down the North Carolina River. The reason is they don't want solutions. They don't want solutions. Here in America, the big drug companies, the big corporations, they're transnational, run everything, including Congress, which is why Congress passed the DARK bill, Denial of Right to Know, on GMO foods, where other countries like Russia and China said, we don't want your GMO food, to hell with you. And it's amazing that the American... Now Texas is passing a GMO labeling bill, and despite the fact Congress passes 275 to 150 vote, and it's going to be before the Senate before they go for summer recess, if they pass this federal bill, you're going to see a major conflict in the courts. And especially places like Texas, they're going to label anyway. And people are just fed up with an incompetent federal government that's a proxy for transnational corporations. And welcome back. And Harley, what do you see with some of the events that are kind of coming up in the near fall? We have the Pope meeting 2 days after 9/11 on Sunday the 13th. We have these very dire, stupid statements by Obama. I mean, what's his next move, chess move, if in fact there's a serious Syrian pushback, or if Hezbollah and Syria decide to start figuring, well, it's the end of the game, they're going to start firing thousands of missiles at Israel, which Israel can't defend. What are they going to do when Israel decides to say they're going to nuke Damascus and many other Islamic cities around them? What the hell are they going to do when places like Riyadh, Saudi Arabia go up in flames because Russia, who already 3 years ago talked to the former king of Saudi Arabia and warned him, because he was treated with great disrespect in Riyadh, Putin was, that he would turn Riyadh into ashes. Now, do they not understand when Mr. Putin makes a statement like that, you better take him seriously? Do they understand that the Russians are not to be pushed around, and the Chinese? They've had it with us. And I don't understand why Obama thinks he can bully, especially when they don't have the military technology, tactics, or strategy, and or even the next step to logically move to combine this with, some kind of statesmanship to deal with the situation. It's just insane. It's like they're like druggies out of control with serious weapons in a closed space. It's like, are you crazy, Obama? Yeah, I think he is. I think Obama and the people above him are out of their freaking minds.
Let me give you another piece of this. It was announced yesterday that all but 3 of the freshman congressmen will be going during August for a special VIP tour of Israel, which will include a special session for them with Netanyahu. And this is funded by the American Israel Public Education Committee, which is part of AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. 50 people altogether, including all but 3 of the freshmen, are going to be going to get brainwashed by Netanyahu, whose line is that Iran is the great threat, Israel has to be freed to nuke Iran, and that the U.S. has to support Israel in that. So that's the degree to which you're seeing the Congress as a captive entity.
Yeah, well, I call the state of Israel, and again, both of us have some Hebrew and Jewish background, so we can make these statements like if you're black, you can talk about blacks. I think the state of Israel, I call it's a real hell. They're out of control. And they're going to yank not only America, but the whole world to a thermonuclear conflict, because Netanyahu views this deal with Iran as a door opener for an attack on Iran, if there's even a twitch sideways in their so-called deal. And, of course, you can guarantee this attack on Syria will make it virtually certain that Israel will have to get involved directly in the conflict, even though they've actually been training and inside ISIS actually supporting the chaos and attack against the Peshmerga forces of the Kurds. And we're bombing the Kurds to say, oops, we bombed you. I mean, this happened last week.
We're letting the Turks bomb the Kurds as part of the deal for us to use the air base there to try and enforce a kind of no-fly zone in northern Syria.
We're doing it. We're doing it, and the thing is, we're dropping air supplies. We're using Turkey as a proxy to give air supplies and support to ISIS. What the heck? Do they understand that the Russians are not brainless, and the Chinese, they know that this is going to destroy the Chinese access to the Iraqi oil fields, where the fifth largest oil company now came out of the Iraqi war because they get access to the oil through the Rothschilds? Do they understand that once the Strait of Hormuz closes, because the Russians and the Iranians will close that strait off with anti-missile systems, so you won't be able to move any cargo through that strait, 1/3 of the oil will stop moving? Do they understand that if nuclear weapons start being used by Israel, Israel will be turned to an ashtray? One multi-level, multiple warheaded Russian nuke hitting to Israel will make sure everyone in Israel, unless you're in an underground bunker, will be turned to ashes.
Well, I don't think it's that they don't understand it. I think that the people behind this are prepared to see millions of people die in the Middle East. They don't care. We're dealing with a satanic force. And I'm not saying
exactly.
It's Jewish, it's Muslim, it's Christian.
No, it's beyond that. These are just labels on a shelf. I call it the Walmart of Satan. I mean, there's all kinds of labels, but they're all just Satanism, one way or another.
It's a satanic force, satanic in the sense that it has no respect for human life and dignity.
Exactly. Yeah. In other words, it's an anti-human, extinguish the human race kind of in a rage attack. And right now, the culmination of that is examples like Obama and George Soros, who are funding all these groups to do orange revolutions and literally propel us forward. I mean, we know that, for example, that George Soros is considered an enemy of the state in many countries. He can't enter countries because they'll immediately arrest him. And yet he's literally one of the main backers of Obama.
And he's also one of the leading global speculators targeting nations, killing them in order to make a profit.
Well, he's not allowed to go back to Britain, or he'll get... He manipulated the British currency, and I think what he did, he caused billions of British pounds sterling to just disappear with his manipulation of the currency market there some years ago. So he's now considered an enemy of the state in Britain. If he enters the British... Great Britain in any way, shape, or form, he's going to be arrested.
And he's done that with the ruble. He's done that with the Asian currencies. He is a killer. And, he justifies it by saying, well, money is neutral, but it's not neutral. It's an instrument of
this
those
guy is
who
a
control
maniac.
it.
He's a socio-psychopath. I recall the story about George Soros that he actually was of Jewish heritage, but what he would do is he would assist the Nazis to pick out the gold teeth out of people's heads after they were executed or died.
Actually, no, the actual story, which he told on 60 Minutes, is he would go to the Nazis and tell them what art treasures and what wealth existed in the Jewish homes in Budapest, where he lived.
Right.
So he was there involved in the looting of the Jewish people for the sake of the Nazis. And he described that on 60 Minutes as one of the most exhilarating moments of his life, and he said it was something that gave him his understanding of how to invest later on.
Wow.
So he equated looting the wealth of Jewish victims of the Nazis with running his hedge funds.
Man, this is a person who has, right down to his DNA, is evil.
And the Russians are to be commended by throwing him out of their country. We should throw him out of here if he's ever in the United States.
Well, the problem is, why do we let people that are supporting him, like, for example, he's there with Beyonce Knowles and Jay-Z supporting Black Lives Matter, and of course they're attacking even Democrats that want to even bring out the real issues on this. Black Lives Matter is attacking anybody, even journalists, that come in there and just ask questions and want to record.
Well, we're dealing with a completely out-of-control fascist police state. That's what people have to realize. It's not just Obama's a megalomaniac or that the elite want to make more money.
But if you decapitate the head of the police state, because he's the one that is the chief conductor with the wand in his hand, the whole system starts to grind to a halt. And then you can start doing things. For example, you can make sure that the current head of the Justice Department starts to prosecute Planned Predator, I've changed their name, by the way. So legally, they should be called Planned Predator now because they want to predate and they actually have, in fact, intact full fetuses, not just body parts. They want the whole thing, God knows for what. And it's an example of just how insane things are. The State Department won't prosecute things that are obvious. They're the violation of law, including Obama's behavior. But yet minor things, they're prosecuting the Christian organization that did sting operations that got the videos. I can't believe them. I mean, this is just mind-boggling. And we've got Miss Elizabeth Warren, from the former so-called Harvard professor, castigating American both Christians, and again, remember, 1/3 of Democrats are pro-life too. They're not just all. It's the leadership are all rabid maniacs. And Elizabeth Warren dares them that they're taking away women's right to control their body. First off, a fetus is not their body. It's a separate genetic structure. And what people don't understand, the right to abortion leads to the right to get rid of the idea of having women at all.
Well, people should go on our website and they'll see these links. It's LaRouchePAC.com, and we've got to take some action quickly. We've got to be heard.
Yeah, if we don't take action, and we can't wait another year, Obama can do so much damage in a year before he leaves. He might even preempt the idea of an election. We might have a dance with all these Republicans and Democrats, and in fact, he brings the United States into such a state of terror there won't be a 2016 election. That's what I'm worried about.
Well, and I think that's where we're headed.
He wants to be Prez for life, as they say.
Talk to you next week.
Take care. Back in a minute with hour number 2, hour 3 coming up with Jonathan Gray.